The new 1200X from Aputure uses a completely new light engine that produces some of the most accurate white light that I've ever seen in an LED. So taking a few steps back and thinking of the 1200E, that was an insanely popular light and was pretty revolutionary at the time because it made HMI level output accessible to the entire filmmaking community. And now we have what feels like the next evolution of that, which is the 1200X. So being that it has an X at the end, you'd correctly assume that it's a bicolor light, but it ends up being so much more than that. Now, to be honest, I've always had this aversion towards bicolor fixtures because although you're able to adjust CCT, there was never really any way to adjust plus or minus grain bias, so they would always just have an annoying color cast when trying to match it with another source, and it would get even worse when mixing with lights from different manufacturers. You could of course use correction gels, but that generally requires a color meter, and I always thought it kind of defeated the purpose of bicolor LEDs in general. For a while, I would always just default to some flavor of RGB so that I could have more control over the white point. But more recently, manufacturers have started implementing plus or minus green in their bicolor units like the Nanlux 2400B or even the Aputure XT26. The 1200X builds off that same idea, but again, this unit uses a completely new light engine that produces some of the best white light that I've seen from any bicolor light, let alone LED in general. Instead of having only two sets of white chips like a typical bicolor LED, it uses a combination of blue, lime, amber, indigo, and red that produces a fully tunable white light. Since this unit has 5 different colors to draw from, you can also use XY coordinates, which is really handy if you're looking for a specific color in a pinch or you're trying to match to another fixture with a color meter. Not only are you getting an overall brighter unit, but also an incredibly accurate light, even at lower intensities. One of my biggest frustrations with a lot of high-powered LEDs are that low-end dimming usually tend to shift super green and look terrible, which is actually why I still like working with sky panels, even though their LED technology is nearly a decade old. They always have super accurate and reliable dimming, which can be just as useful as high output. So along with the new color engine, there are a bunch of neat little improvements, including this really awesome PL-style Bowens mount. So there's no play with your modifiers when you're attaching them. And this really awesome header cable that's really similar to ones you'd find on Arri HMIs. So this new lighting engine is designed as a fully tunable white light, as opposed to something like the 600C or CS15, which are full color units. And I'll leave the finer details to Andrew Locke, but TLDR, the white light is just really, really good. Since the 1200X is using a lime diode as opposed to a green, it maintains surprisingly consistent white light across all of the intensities. Here's some of the photometrics I measured at 15 feet using the wide reflector if you want a photon peep. But in summary, it has some of the best SSI scores I've seen on any LED fixture at 86 for both daylight and tungsten. 3200 degrees measures out to 3223 with a nearly perfect delta UV, and 5600 degrees measures out to 5670 with a 0.0037 delta UV, which is equivalent to about an eighth correction gel. But again, you don't need correction gels, which is the beauty of this light because the white is fully tunable. Another impressive metric are the extreme ends of the CCT range. Usually on any adjustable LED light, the ends kind of fall off in terms of quality and also come with some sort of heavy color shift. But 2500 Kelvin read straight as an arrow at 2519 with a delta UV of 0.0003. The only thing that went down was its TM30 fidelity score at 90 and saturation at 95. Same goes for the opposite end at 10,000 Kelvin. I measured 10,313 at a delta UV of 0.0037, and TM30 stayed pretty consistent at 95 RF and 99 RG. Also, I want to mention that I had the light set to CIE mode for all my testing, and there's also an option to tune to black bounding emitters in the menu. What I think is equally as impressive are the low-end capabilities of this unit. We've all been there where we've had a light at 0.1% and it still feels way too bright. And usually, as a rule of thumb, if you're using a light at under 1%, you're probably using the wrong fixture, but I get it. Sometimes it's all we have, or sometimes we just need to keep the momentum moving without having to swap heads on a stand. So I also understand the value in having high output fixtures that can also perform on the lower end. I've used RGB LEDs in the past that have had terrible color shift when you're 10% or under. But again, the 1200X has such a precise level of color throughout the entire range. Here are a bunch of readings that I took starting at 10% and just gradually going down. The difference in Kelvin never strays over 150 degrees and beyond an eighth correction gel. What's even crazier is that even at the lowest intensity, I'm barely reading a single foot candle, so it almost looks like the light isn't even on. All right, so before we take a look at a few side-by-side comparisons, I want to first mention the sponsor of today's video, and that's CordBag. CordBag makes really high-quality storage accessories that I bring with me on literally every job, whether I'm consolidating media or like this, where I like keeping all of my small camera AKS together. They feel super premium because they are made with high-quality, durable materials that you could actually count on when you're using them in the field. I'm always bringing a bunch with me on set, and not only do they help me stay organized, but they're also super helpful for my ACs because everything is clearly labeled, so they know exactly where everything is. They have a bunch of new products coming out from NAB that I literally haven't even got my hands on yet because they're still sold out. But CordBag is actually doing a huge anniversary sale where you can get up to 30% off. And if you use my code is that I read on checkout, you can take an additional 15% off your entire order. So get organized and check out CordBag. Also, if you had watched through this segment all the way through my last video, you might have seen a secret message that only literally 2 people ended up catching. So shout out to Ultra Darlim for paying attention and winning a free cord pouch. So slide in my DMs and I'll hook you up. So I recently did a poll on Instagram comparing a few different fixtures, and granted, Instagram probably doesn't condone the best viewing environment, so I'm going to display them here. And what I want you to do is try to pick the one that you think represents the best skin tone. So this first set is daylight balanced, and the first one is a Nanlex 1200B. B is a Sky Panel as 60, C is the new 1200X, and D is an M18. So this is where I think things start to get really interesting because for a while now, HMIs have pretty much been the de facto standard in terms of emulating daylight sources because they're daylight balanced, they have a ton of output, and they have a nice full-bodied spectrum to help kind of portray colors most naturally as they appear. So purely objectively speaking, D should have been the best at portraying skin tones. But that's objectively. So subjectively, the 1200X actually ended up getting the most votes at 32%. It's always interesting seeing different people's preferences for skin tone and what looks better than the other, and so this is where it starts to get a little bit subjective. When I scrub through all of these clips, to me, the 1200X has the least amount of color shift when compared to an HMI, especially when you kind of look at the vector scope. They're all pretty much in the same ballpark, but once you kind of flip through them really quickly, you kind of start to see where a lot of the differences are. So when I compare the 1200X with the HMI, this is the Aputure 1200X, this is the HMI. They look pretty similar, honestly. If I were to say anything, it might be that the 1200X saturation might be a little less than the HMI. In that case, all I would really do is just slightly, ever so slightly boost my saturation, and I feel like I'm looking at pretty similar results. In terms of tungsten, A was the Sky Panel, B was an Area 650, C was still the 1200X, and D was the Nanlex 1200B. What's super interesting here is that 50% of the votes actually went for true tungsten, which is basically one of the purest forms of light that you can use. It's just super energy inefficient. And the runner-up ended being the Namlux 1200B. And again, I think it has something to do with saturation because, again, when you compare the two side by side, you can see that the Namlux definitely has a little bit more saturation in terms of the vector scope. So even if I went here and added a node and then looked at both of them, boosted my saturation to kind of match the 1200B, and then look at them side by side, they look pretty identical. So the last thing I want to mention about skin tone is we all know that skin tones are all different. And with my face specifically, when I'm lighting for my YouTube videos, I always find that I have trouble with this area, kind of around my lips, this kind of magenta, more reddish skin tone. And I always end up having to pull a separate qualifier or a separate key just for this shade of skin tone right here, because a lot of times the LEDs that I'm using kind of never really portray this skin tone in a way that I like personally. So really quick, I want to just show you what I mean here. So here again is the M18. Objectively should be one of the best options in terms of skin tone. Next up, 1200X, still pretty good and kind of out of the box. I kind of have no problems with this shade of red. But once we start going to the S60, for example, I find that I always lose a ton of saturation in this particular shade of red. And so for me, when I'm watching myself while I'm editing, it always looks like I'm kind of devoid of life. It always looks like I have these super pale lips, and this shade of red always just loses a ton of saturation. So again, that's why I have to usually I end up pulling a separate key just for this area. So an S60 is something that I use all the time. Uses RGBW technology, and kind of similar thing here with the 1200B. Again, I'm getting a little bit more saturation in the lips, but it's definitely not as magenta and not, I guess, as full of life, if that makes sense. And another thing that's really interesting too, if I kind of maximize my scopes here, and really quick, I just want to show you what this looks like magnified. So if I pull a qualifier here and see what this looks like on the vector scope, you kind of have this big red loop that's almost pointing towards the red chip on the vector scope. So I can do that same thing on the 1200X. And again, those two keys are pretty similar. And again, the one thing that I want to bring up is just this kind of loop here. And it's just this one thing that I've noticed. So if I go to these other fixtures, like this is the sky panel, and if I pull that same key, I'm almost getting half a loop here. I just found that super interesting. So even if I just kind of do this quick key right here, I'm getting kind of half this loop, and then this kind of section of the vector scope is just kind of gone. So again, I think it's really interesting, especially given the completely new light engine in the 1200X. And it's always an issue that I've always seemed to face. And it's not only with my skin. Sometimes I'll be grading a clip of someone and they kind of have different patches of red across their face, and LEDs sometimes just don't have that full-bodied spectrum, and a lot of times as you can light them as best you can, but there's still something about the skin tone that just kind of looks a little bit lifeless, and it takes a lot of extra work to grade it. There's just something about this specific hue that always gives me a little bit of trouble. It always just kind of starts blending in with the rest of my skin tone, and I kind of don't want that. I kind of like having that separation here, and to me it feels like it gives it just a little bit more life. And then if we go over to the 1200X, there's that clear magenta separation from the skin tone, which I'm always kind of missing with other LED fixtures. In my experience, the 1200B and the 1200X actually look pretty similar out of the box, but where the 1200X really shines is its ability to tune green and magenta shift in different lighting environments, and that's something that I'm doing all the time so that I can help make my lighting feel a little bit more invisible. I was just on a recent job shooting some WNBA interviews, and I knew I wanted to use the 1200X to match with the ambient house lights, but we didn't have any 6x rags or modifiers handy, so we just shot it into a 7-foot umbrella with the wide reflector, and it ended up filling it beautifully. I love using Hudson Spider lights, but they still have the same problem that most other bicolor units have, which is not being able to easily control plus or minus green. And that 1% can be a make or break when you're trying to make your lights feel natural and kind of within the environment. This setup almost feels like it has a smaller footprint than a regular Light Dome 150, even with the larger surface area because the softbox isn't so deep. But either way, it was really cool having a similar quality of light to a Hudson Redback, but with a much more refined color consistency and nearly 3 times the output. On this setup, we did this sort of cove booklight where we bounced into a wall of ultra bounce sans reflector and then through some full grid. Again, using my color meter to match with the warmer house lights, so our talent still has a nice key, but kind of still blends in with the environment. Here's an instance where I'll use a mixture of XY and Delta UV to match with a completely different set of units. In this case, we're using a Nanlux Dyno 1200 and the Aputure 1200X to create a wall of light against these massive windows, and right off the bat, I could see a pretty noticeable difference in tint between the two, so I decided to match to the older RGBW panel and then got myself in a similar ballpark because my guess is that the RGBW unit would have a lot tougher time keeping up with the BLAIR light engine, so whenever I'm mixing brands, I'll pick one unit as my baseline and then match the other so that they're both uniform, and then it becomes much easier in the grade to adjust further if you need. I've had a really fantastic time with this new unit, and it's cool seeing LED technology start to bridge the gap between tried and true industry standards that have been around for generations. If you care about color fidelity, if you care about what you're putting in front of your lens, I would highly recommend checking these units out because the 1200X is a noticeable step up from anything else on the market.